Nazi Germany was the period of Germany between 1933 and 1945, from when Hitler took control of Germany as Chancellor to when Germany lost World War II. Before we look at life in Nazi Germany, it's important to see how Hitler managed to consolidate his power. So on January the 30th, 1933, Hitler was appointed as Chancellor. Hindenburg initially refused to appoint him as Chancellor, but eventually they couldn't find anyone else to appoint. The Reichstag was so unstable, they thought Hitler would be able to create stability. And they thought they could use him to form a stable Reichstag, but it turns out that this was a bad move, because Hitler only managed to this acted as a catalyst for Hitler to take power after he was appointed as Chancellor, to really take power over all of Germany. Now, some of the weaknesses with this: there are only 2 other Nazis in the 12-man cabinet, and Hindenburg could dismiss Hitler at any time he wanted. The Nazis didn't have a majority in the Reichstag yet. Also, Nazi popularity had fallen by 2 million votes in the November 1932 election, so it had dropped from the first 1932 election from around 37% to the November 1932 election, which was around 33%. So Nazi popularity had fallen. This was a problem. Trade unions, opposing political parties, civil service, state government, and army could all oppose Hitler. So these were some of the weaknesses with his position. Now, on February the 4th, 1933, Hindenburg issued a decree, and this said that all election meetings had to have 48 hours notice, and that the police had the power to prevent any election meeting which was seen as a threat to public security. And on February the 17th, 1933, the SA and nationalist meetings were not to be impeded by the police. On February the 22nd, Goering appointed the SA as auxiliary police officers. So Goering was a leading member of the Nazi Party. He was also a German politician. He was really one of the leaders of the Nazi Party along with Hitler. And auxiliary basically just means it's part-time help to the current police force. So the SA, the paramilitary group, these brown shirts run by Ernst Röhm, were going to help the current police force. So these guys were gaining more power, and they were going to abuse that power. Now on February the 27th, 1933, we had the Reichstag fire, which was an extremely significant event. The Reichstag fire. And this was arguably one of the major ways the Nazis were able to gain power. So here we have the Reichstag. With the Reichstag, which is on fire. The Reichstag caught fire. The German parliament caught fire on February the 27th, 1933. And they've investigated and they found this gentleman, Marinus van der Lubbe. Marinus van der Lubbe, and it turns out he was a Dutch communist. So some people claim, so the Nazis actually used van der Lubbe as a scapegoat. Since he was a communist, they blamed it on him, even though there's no evidence that it actually was him. Some people claim it was a Nazi plot and that he was just a scapegoat. But they blamed it on him. The Nazis blamed it on him because he was a Dutch communist, and they managed to use this so that the German people didn't trust the communists anymore. Because after the Great Depression, support for the NSDAP and KPD rose. Extreme parties rose. So if the NSDAP support rose after the Great Depression, and the KPD support rose. But after this Reichstag fire, the Nazis blamed the communists. The Nazis blamed the KPD, these communists, for causing the Reichstag fire, which meant the KPD support just dropped, which means the Nazis could get more popular. So the Reichstag fire was blamed on the communists so that the NSDAP could gain power. So it's kind of a nice it's kind of a nice way for Hitler to try and gain power here. The day later, on February the 28th, 1933, we have the Reichstag Fire Decree. This is an emergency decree which suspends all civil liberties, such as the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, even freedom to own firearms and things like that. On March the 5th, 1933, just 6 or so days, well, not too long after the Reichstag fire, we have the Reichstag election. And this was the last really proper election until they just got rigged by the Nazis. This was the last proper election. And the NSDAP managed to get 44% of the votes, or 288 seats. And the other party's support just fell. The NSDAP unleashed a reign of terror and violence against their opponents, especially the KPD after the Reichstag fire, justified by this scapegoat. And even so, even though they terrorized their opponents, they didn't even manage to get a majority or be able to form a coalition. But it doesn't even matter that he didn't get a majority, because as we're about to see, he's going to pass the Enabling Act, which effectively gives him dictatorial powers. On March the 13th, Joseph Goebbels was appointed as the Minister of Propaganda, so he was responsible for all the media in Germany. Now, on March the 24th, 1933, we have the Enabling Act passed, and this allows Hitler, the Chancellor, to rule Germany by decree with no reference to the Reichstag or president, effectively giving him dictatorial powers. And you may be thinking this is crazy, and it is crazy, but it was only supposed to last 4 years. But then, of course, we have Hindenburg's death, and Hitler just combines his role of Chancellor and Führer, Chancellor and President to become Führer, but this is only supposed to last 4 years. So it's only supposed to last 4 years. And also, this had to get voted in, and it succeeded 444 votes to 94. Most people were in favor of it. Not many people weren't in favor of it, because the Nazis were actually being very hostile and aggressive towards their opponents. Some people might have been afraid to say, no, we don't want to pass the Enabling Act. So on April 7th, 1933, the civil service, people who work in government agencies in Germany, was purged of alien elements. So this meant Jews and other people who didn't fit with Hitler's idea of a master race could no longer work in government agencies. They could no longer work in the civil service. On the 1st of May 1933, workers were granted a May Day holiday, which might have allowed them to kind of form a connection with Hitler. I don't know, they might have felt Hitler was a good man for giving them this. On May 2nd, 1933, all trade unions were banned. So trade unions, people who fight for workers' rights. The trade unions were replaced by the DAF, which stands for the German Labour Front. And why did they ban trade unions? Because trade unions were responsible for the general strike from the 1920 cap putsch. They stopped producing goods. This is when workers stopped producing goods and effectively crippled the leaders. So they didn't want another general strike to happen against the Nazis, so they banned trade unions. So on June the 9th, 1933, we have the major public work projects being announced, such as the Autobahns, high-speed motorway. So it seems like Hitler knows what he's doing here as Chancellor. On the 14th of July, 5 days later, well, this is actually a month later, but nonetheless, we have a law against the formation of new parties, which effectively means Germany's a one-party state. This is pretty significant. This is a first step towards totalitarianism, but it's still legal because of the Enabling Act. On July 20th, with the Concordat. This is the agreement with the Catholic Church. We'll go into more detail with this later, but this is July the 20th. Next, we have the Night of the Long Knives, which happened the next year in June 1934, the next year. So they killed 200 political leaders and members of the SA in the Night of the Long Knives. The SS carries out the murders. The SS effectively replaces the SA, so the SA now effectively becomes the SS.
yeah, the SA was becoming too independent, so Hitler really wanted to get rid of it. Ernst Röhm was murdered, as well as some other political leaders. It was justified by saying that Rome was actually planning a coup against the Nazi Party, but this was just Hitler's excuse to justify why he killed all these leaders. And it was the first illegal action that Hitler undertook. So he did it because he wanted to give the army more influence. He wanted he knew the SA was becoming too independent, and he wanted the SS to take control so that he chose the army over the SA. He wanted the army to gain more influence. And we have Rome murdered, the leader of the SS. He was becoming too independent. We have von Kahr, who was one of the people in the failed Munich putsch who put it down. And also von Schleicher, who was a previous chancellor, a rival to Hitler. These are just some of his political opponents that were murdered, but it was really just to gain power and to give the army more influence and to make sure that the SA, who was becoming too independent, didn't threaten Hitler's political ambitions. So as you can see, the SA was a paramilitary group founded by Hitler to harass and intimidate rival political parties. The SA wore brown uniforms, they wore brown uniforms, and were often called the brown shirts. We know this. By 1933, this is the important part, the SA was a very large organization that threatened the cohesion of the standard military and Hitler's political ambitions. They threatened Hitler's political ambitions, so he decided to shut it down. So he disposed of the SA in the Night of the Long Knives, which effectively brought the regime to an end. The SS were Hitler's very own private bodyguards, and after the dissolvement of the SA, this would replace it. So the SS replaced the SA and became the new paramilitary organization, and they were feared a lot, and these soldiers took an oath to protect Hitler and the Nazi ideology until death, and the leader was Heinrich Himmler.
In order to understand the Night of the Long Knives better, we need to look at how Hitler had to make his decision between the SA and the army in mid-1934. By mid-1934, there was a power struggle in Nazi leadership. It was clear that Hitler had to make a choice between the SA and the army. So looking at the SA, throughout the rise of the Nazis, Hitler had depended on the SA to put his policies into action. They had fought loyally for Hitler against the communists and helped him come to power. By 1934, the SA was an enormous organization with more than 2 million members. It was also very powerful. In fact, its leader Ernst Röhm was a potential rival to Hitler. Röhm wanted Hitler to continue the Nazi revolution by reducing the power of big business and carrying out the anti-capitalist parts of the Nazi program, such as taking over major industries. Röhm also wanted the SA to take control of the army. On the other hand, the army was much smaller than the SA. It only had 100,000 soldiers. The army leadership was supported by big business. They wanted Hitler to expand the army and to buy new weapons. The army was totally opposed to being taken over by the SA and was very suspicious of Rome. Hitler had always known how important the army was in gaining effective control of Germany. The opposition of the army had been the main problem in 1923 when the Munich Putsch had failed. As soon as he became Chancellor on the 3rd of February 1933, he went to the army leaders to explain his aims. He told them he intended to rearm Germany, thus overturning a central part of the Treaty of Versailles, and to take over Lebensraum in Eastern Europe. He also told them that his plans would involve defeating France in a war. While many army leaders might have welcomed such plans, others remained very suspicious of Hitler. Many of the army chiefs were from upper-class families and rather looked down on Hitler. On the other hand, they agreed with Hitler's nationalist aims and his beliefs that the army needed to be much larger. So what are some reasons for Hitler choosing the SA? He had to choose one or the other, he couldn't have both. So some reasons for is that Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, was an old friend of Hitler. Also, the SA had fought for Hitler in 1923 in the Munich Putsch, and in later fights against the communists, for instance, against the KPD. The SA terrorized the KPD, which helped Hitler come to power after the Reichstag fire was falsely blamed on them. But also, the SA were committed Nazis. And also, the SA had 2.5 million
members, 2.5 million men, which was much larger than the army if it came to a fight. Some reasons against choosing the SA is because the SA was beginning to get out of hand, interfering in the running, the stability of the country, and the law courts, so this was particularly significant. It also disapproved of some Nazi leaders, and if Hitler used the SA to control the army, then Hitler would have to go along with the SA's other demands. Hitler also didn't agree with many of the SA's anti-capitalist policies and working-class aims. So these sort of resembled communism, and Hitler was more capitalist. Although it wasn't completely capitalist, it gets a bit confusing, but he was more socialist. But he didn't agree with these anti-capitalist policies and working class aims of the SA. Some reasons for choosing the army was that it was well-trained, organized, and disciplined. It was the only organization which at the time had the power to remove Hitler, and it had support of big business and conservatives, which would have helped Hitler's overall support. And an efficient army was needed to retake land lost via the Treaty of Versailles. So the SA would have been less efficient, the army would have been more efficient in retaking this land as they were more disciplined and trained, etc. Some reasons against choosing the army: it was small and it only had 100,000 men. How loyal the army would be to Hitler was unknown. And some generals disliked Hitler and the Nazis. Hitler's Austrian, he's not even German. Hitler's too extreme. Some generals didn't like him. So what did Hitler think of Rome and the SA? So I'll proceed to read this out. Rome was a tough soldier who had fought both in the German army in the First World War and in the Free Corps after it. He was one of Hitler's earliest supporters. He had helped create the SA as a private army. In 1923, Rome stood alongside Hitler in the Munich Putsch. He was not sent to prison and was appointed by Hitler to keep the party going, whilst Hitler served his sentence. Rome had an unruly temper. He was on bad terms with some other Nazi leaders, particularly Goering, whom he disliked for his aristocratic manner, and Himmler, commander of the SS. The debate over the SA had been rumbling for 10 years. In 1924, Rome had quarreled with Hitler about it. Rome wanted to replace the German army when the Nazis won power. After the quarrel, he had emigrated to Bolivia, where as a military advisor he helped build an army and fought in the war. By 1930, Hitler was having trouble controlling the SA. Most of them were simply thugs, so he asked Rome to return to take control of them. Rome made them a more disciplined body, but still wanted them to become the most powerful force in Germany. However, Rome was devoted to Hitler and was a very efficient organizer. He was also homosexual and a drunkard, but Hitler was not worried about this in the early years. So Hitler ended up choosing the army. The SA was out of control. It was too hostile. He ended up choosing the army, which was more disciplined. So on the 29th of June, 1934, Hitler acted. He called a meeting of the SA leaders for the following day at Wiessee in Bavaria. On the 30th of June, we have the Night of the Long Knives, as we've seen on the 30th of June. Several days later, on the 13th of July, 1934, after he killed Rome and all those leaders on the 30th of June, several days later, on the 13th of July, Hitler told the Reichstag that Rome had been arrested and shot because it was plotting to seize power. But this wasn't really true. The smoothness of the massacres is the smoothness with which the murders of the massacres were carried out is powerful proof that no Rome plot was imminent. There was no resistance encountered anywhere. Many victims were unsuspectingly surrendered, voluntarily believing it was all a mistake. The only shots fired were those of the executioners, and the number of victims estimated between 150 and 200. So it's quite clear that Rome really didn't support. Rome wasn't plotting to seize power. Hitler just used this as an excuse for the Night of the Long Knives, and so that he can get rid of the SA, which is becoming an increasing problem. And he was going to essentially replace it with the SS.
So after the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler has eliminated his main problem, which was the SA, which was getting out of control. So there's one final thing in our timeline before our timeline of his consolidation of power, and that's the death of Hindenburg in August 1934. So after the death of Hindenburg, there's no president, so Hitler becomes Führer. He becomes the absolute dictator of Germany. He combines the position of chancellor and president, and in the army swears an oath of loyalty to Hitler. So Hitler has finished his consolidation of power. He has finally became the absolute dictator of Germany, and we're stepping in. This is this bedrock of totalitarianism. So quickly reviewing Hitler's methods of consolidating power between 1933 and 1934. How did he do it? He used propaganda. So he used censorship to promote the Nazis and prevent dissent. He brought in Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, very successful Minister of Propaganda. And we also have the Reichstag fire, February 1933. And it was blamed on the communists, which meant the Nazis gained support as support for communists fell. We also have the use of the law, the Enabling Act, which allows the Chancellor to not have to consult the Reichstag, and the law against the formation of new parties. He also uses terror and intimidations. For instance, in the Night of the Long Knives, he kills many of the threats to him. He kills Rome, since the SA is getting out of hand. He also terrorizes and intimidates the KPD after the Reichstag fire. He terrorizes and intimidates the KPD in order to consolidate his power. He also brings in new organizations to help him get to power, such as the SS, his new paramilitary group, and the DAF, the German Labour Front, no more trade unions. Hitler was also somewhat popular. In March 1933, he achieved 44% of the vote, which isn't surprising given that the communists were blamed for the Reichstag fire. But he also gave a May Day, a free holiday, which gained some popular support, allowing him to consolidate power. We also have concessions, deals. Concessions are just deals. For instance, the Concordat, the 20th of July 1933 Concordat. And we also have Air of Respectability, the Knights of the Long Knives, which is justified as preventing a coup, as well as hostels and soup kitchens for poorer citizens. But these are the main things you need to know about Hitler's consolidation of power. So we know how he consolidated power now. Now that we're finished with Hitler's consolidation of power, we can finally start looking at life. We can finally start looking at life in Nazi Germany. What was life like in Nazi Germany? One of the most important characteristics about Nazi Germany is that it was a totalitarian state. And what does that mean? Well, here are some of the characteristics of a totalitarian state. Firstly, it's a one-party state. All other parties are banned, as we've seen, and the only party allowed is the NSDAP. Secondly, it was a dictatorship with the emphasis on Hitler, the leader, Adolf Hitler. And it was a bit of a personality cult, in the sense that there was excessive public admiration for this political leader, Hitler. Secondly, it was a police state, and the police state meant that no dissent was allowed. So no dissenting from Nazi ideologies was allowed, or the police state. The police would come and get you. The secret police would come and get you. Another characteristic of a totalitarian state is propaganda. Propaganda is used to promote Nazi ideals and prevent alternative viewpoints from being heard. So dissent. And the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, would be in control of propaganda. Another characteristic is a lack of basic freedom, such as the freedom of speech or the freedom of association. Freedom of association is the right to form societies, clubs, or other groups of people. It's also called the freedom of assembly. I'm going to take a look at the role of the SS. The SS is obviously the Schutzstaffel, a major paramilitary organization founded in 1925. It had around 800,000 members who were fanatically loyal to Hitler. And so what was the role of the SS?
So first with the Gestapo, who were the secret state police. They ruthlessly suppressed opposition to the Nazis in Germany and occupied Europe and sent Jews and others to concentration camps. So let's have a look into more detail. So it was under the command of a gentleman named Reinhard Heydrich, and it was also established by Himmler as well. But it would arrest citizens on suspicion of dissent. The SS also had a role in the police and courts who could carry out political snooping, checking what other people are up to, making sure they're not dissenting from Nazi ideology. And the Nazis also controlled the judges and magistrates. So the Nazis controlled the judges and magistrates. Clearly, this is not a very suitable or democratic system. Now we have the SS Death's Heads units, the Death's Heads units, and these were responsible for the concentration camps and the actual Holocaust, the actual slaughter of the Jews. And the Waffen SS were just rearmed regiments who fought alongside the regular army. The SS also had a role in concentration camps, which appeared within 2 months of Hitler actually taking power. So these were set up in 1933. They really quickly, within 2 months of Hitler coming to power, the SS Death's Heads units were in charge. The SS Death's Head units were in charge. And we have people like Jews, communists, trade unionists. So I'll just write trade union, but trade unionists, churchmen, and critics of Nazi ideology. Churchmen and other critics of Nazism. They were all sent to the concentration camps. Now, quick clarification, although the Waffen-SS were rearmed regiments who fought alongside the regular army, they also controlled the concentration camps, which were different from the death camps. So I should make clear that the Death's Head units, the SS Death's Head units, they controlled, not the concentration camps, but they controlled the death camps, where Jews were actually slaughtered. They controlled the death camps. But the Waffen-SS controlled the concentration camps, where there was food was limited and there was hard labor. Now, adding to the Gestapo, they would tap phones in people's mail. They would send people to prison without any legal trial. And they also sent people to concentration camps. Well, I shouldn't necessarily say prison. They just arrested people without trial and sent people to concentration camps. The final role of the SS was its role in the Nazi courts. They took over the existing legal system. Judges had to take an oath of loyalty to the Nazis, so it was completely rigged. And the minimum age for capital punishment minimum age was just 16 years old. Now I want to look at some opposition to Nazi Germany. Obviously, everyone didn't just go along with it. There was opposition, and we're going to look at that now. So if we're looking at left-wing groups, we obviously have KPD, which was left-wing, and the SPD, which wasn't really left-wing, but there were KPD and SPD underground networks after 1933. However, this was affected by Stalin's instructions that the KPD should not work with the SPD. Who knows, maybe if the KPD did end up working with the SPD, they could have formed a stable alliance with some strong underground networks which could have possibly opposed Hitler in a powerful way. Now, let's take a look at some youth oppositions. So we have the White Rose Group led by Hans, this guy Hans, and Sophie Scholl, who are brothers and sisters. So Hans Scholl, and Sophie Scholl. And this was the White Rose Group. So the White Rose Group, these guys distributed anti-Nazi leaflets during World War II. And they were going relatively well, but unfortunately, Hans and Sophie Scholl were both executed. They were executed in 1943. Now we also have a group called the Swing Movement. And these people generally listened to African American music. So they listened to African American or black music, and they were generally middle class teenagers. Often they were rich. And this swing movement accepted Jews, so that was one of the things the Nazis didn't like about them. These guys were also non-political. They did not espouse to Nazism, so they went against expected behavior, another reason why the Nazis didn't like them. And in 1941, 300 members of the swing movement were arrested. Now we also have the Edelweiss Pirates. The Edelweiss Pirates. Now these were working class teens, generally poor, unlike the people in the swing movement. Now these guys taunted the Hitler Youth and mocked Germany. They also had anti-Nazi graffiti. They also sheltered army deserters, so people who withdrew from the war didn't want to fight anymore. And the main thing about them is they were just a group of rebels, a group of working class poor teens who disliked the strict regimentation and separation of gender in the Hitler Youth. So basically there's a bunch of teens who hated the way the Hitler Youth was run, and so they taunted the Hitler Youth, did anti-Nazi graffiti, sheltered the army deserters. And unfortunately 12 leaders were executed. 12 leaders were executed. Towards the end of the war, the army was also looking towards Hitler unfavorably. It was clear Germany was going to lose, yet he still didn't surrender. So we have the July bomb plot in 1944. So in July 1944, the army officers attempted to remove Hitler, then just use the army to take control of Berlin. As I said, it related to the fact that the war was going badly by 1944. From the east, you have the USSR coming in. The USSR coming in from the east, and from the west you have the UK and France now coming in, and they're surrounding Germany. So the war is going badly at this point. So they put a bomb under the conference table. Hitler survives, but others were killed, and this was due to a leg in front of Hitler, so it exploded on the leg and it didn't kill him, but others were killed. Now Klaus von Stauffenberg, one of the leaders of the July bomb plot, escapes to Berlin. He does escape to Berlin, but the rebellion fails. The July bomb plot fails, the rebellion fails, and he is executed. He is eventually executed for trying to assassinate, being one of the main leaders who tried to assassinate Hitler, Klaus von Stauffenberg. Finally, the churches were also in opposition to Nazi Germany. Now we have Bishop Galen, who criticized the Nazis, and he protested against euthanasia. So he protested against euthanasia because the Nazis were killing people who were deemed as a burden to society, such as the elderly or some disabled people. So he protested against this, and it was a success. It was successful. It was a success. And the policy of euthanasia was stopped in 1941. Policy stopped in 1941. However, However, around on the order of 72,000 people were already killed. Now, the thing with Galen is the Nazis took no action against him at the time. We also have this gentleman here. This gentleman, Martin Niemöller. And he was a member of the Confessional Church. And he was the most prominent critic of the Nazis in the 1930s. Now we also have this gentleman, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Let me respell this. Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was also a member of the Confessional Church, and a famous quote from him is that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. So when the Nazis came, when people were silent, he's claiming that that was evil. They needed to do something about the Nazis. So Dietrich believed Christianity should not accept the Nazis' racist views. So he believed churchmen had to be free to preach against Nazism, and that Christians had a duty to resist Nazism and help victims of it. Unfortunately, he was arrested in 1942 and executed in April 1945. Here's a question. Why was there such little opposition to Nazi Germany? So as you saw, we had these small groups, the White Rose group, these KPD, some church members, but there's not really any serious opposition to Nazi Germany. Why was there such little opposition? First reason is that the Nazis had popular policies that the people wanted. For instance, the reversal of the Treaty of Versailles. Nobody liked the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazis promised to reverse it, so hey, let's support the Nazis. They also promised Lebensraum, the expansion of Germany. Who wouldn't want Germany to gain more space? So Nazis had popular policies, that's why there was a little opposition. We also have the use of propaganda leading to a lack of information. Some people mightn't have been aware of the negatives of Nazi Germany, for instance, the killing of the Jews. And the Nazis used propaganda to indoctrinate younger people so that they were also unaware of the negatives. Another reason is because opposition was banned. The general public feared to display their opposition because they would be crushed by the Gestapo or sent to concentration camps without trial. The Nazis intimidated and terrorized their opponents. Also, opposition was divided, so there wasn't any serious opposition. For instance, the SPD and KVD, as we've seen, the SPD and KPD refused to cooperate under the order of Stalin. Another reason that there was little opposition is because the Nazis were popular anyway. They were voted into power. They received 43% of the vote in the March 1933 election, the final election before the whole system was rigged. We also have unpopular policies being reversed, such as the euthanasia after Galen complained, and anti-Semitism was toned down during the Olympics. Finally, it's quite evident that any existing opposition to the Nazis was crushed, which was the reason there was very little. For instance, the Edelweiss Pirates, the 12 leaders were executed. Hans and Sophie Schell of the White Rose Group were executed. 300 of the Swing Movement members were arrested. Stauffenberg, the leader of the July bomb plot, was executed. Bonhoeffer, one of the critics of the Nazis in the church, was executed. And Niemöller, another critic, was arrested. So we can see that existing opposition is just crushed completely. Another point I want to add quickly is that some violent acts were falsely justified. For instance, the Reichstag fire in 1933 was blamed on the communists, although there isn't complete evidence that it was the communists. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 was blamed on Ernst Röhm, when it was really just because Hitler wanted to clear the SA so that he could be more secured. And also Kristallnacht in 1938, the Night of the Broken Glass, was claimed to be a spontaneous reaction when it was really a planned attack on the Jews. Let's take a look at the German economy, which was pretty important, and let's take a look at autarky in Hitler's Germany. As we know, autarky is economic self-sufficiency. So let's take a look at some of the main economic aims. Firstly, they wanted to reduce unemployment. Obviously, there were 6 million unemployed in 1932, and this was a big problem. They also wanted to build up the German armaments industry and enlarge the German military, and of course they did this from the 100,000 enforced by the Treaty of Versailles to 550,000 by 1935. It also wants autarky. Obviously, it doesn't want to suffer with blockades like it had to in World War I. Some problems with some of these aims. Well, the first was exporting goods was difficult due to the collapse of trade, due to the collapse of world trade following the 1929 Great Depression. Germany was also short. The German army was also short of key raw materials such as oil. And they'd need to go eastwards to get oil, as we've seen. And we also know Germany could not afford to pay for too many imports. So to fix these problems, we have Hjalmar Schacht's new plan from 1933 to 1937. And Hjalmar Schacht was a German economist. He served as president of the Reichsbank under the Weimar Republic, and he was appointed by Hitler to sort out the economy. So we have a new plan from 1933 to 1937. One of the first things in his plan was that imports were to be cut down, imports were to be limited, because they were expensive and Germany couldn't afford them. He also introduced trade agreements such as bartering or swapping. So you give me this good, I'll give you that good. For example, Germany would give certain goods in order to get oil because it needed oil. Government spending was also to be spread over many industries, not just the military. And he managed to reduce unemployment by giving public work projects such as autobahns, motorways. Conscription from 1933. So this obviously helped reduce unemployment since a lot of people would be joining the army. Unfortunately, Jews were also dismissed from the workforce to allow other people to get jobs. And they also limited the role of women in the workforce. The role of women was different in Hitler's eyes. He wanted them to be more at home and focus on children, but we go into that later. So overall, this man Schacht managed to solve Germany's economic problems. However, Hitler wanted to prepare Germany for war and rearm quickly. Schacht said that this was not possible. Schacht said it was not possible to prepare Germany for war and rearm quickly, so Schacht he said this wasn't possible, and he resigned. He resigned in 1937. So in 1937, he resigned as Germany's Minister of Economics, and Hermann Goering ends up replacing him as the Minister of Economics, as the German Minister of Economics. So after Schacht resigned, Hermann Goering replaced him as the German Minister of Economics, and Hermann Goering introduced his 4-year plan in 1937, and this was to prepare Germany for war. So the fundamental goal was to prepare Germany for war within 4 years. So we'll do this by increasing production of raw materials for war, such as oil. He also wanted to persuade big businesses to produce synthetic raw materials, so chemically produced raw materials, to imitate real raw materials, such as oil from coal. But he also wanted to further reduce imports, just like Schacht did. He also wanted to tighten the control of wages and prices. He also wanted to use forced labor if necessary, so this was getting pretty extreme. He also wanted to build new industrial plants, and he managed to build the Hermann Goering Works. By 1939, Germany still relied on imports for a third of its raw materials. So it still heavily relied on imports, despite trying to cut down and reduce imports. Goering had also neglected consumer goods for the production of military goods, and this led to the guns versus butter debate. So consumers were unhappy because there were too many guns being produced and not enough butter being produced. For example, if we draw guns on our x-axis and butter on our y-axis, and we have the production possibility curve, consumers would like to have something along this curve, and generally we'd like to have 0 guns being produced and maximum butter being produced. But Goering went the other way around. So Goering went the other way around. He produced virtually no consumer goods, or not very many, and heaps of guns. So it wasn't that extreme, but generally we've shacked up here. We've shacked up here, producing more consumer goods and less military goods. But we have Goering over here producing less consumer goods and too many military goods. So here we have Goering. So there's a clear contrast between the two German economic ministers. Let's talk about workers in Nazi Germany. Hitler had managed to gain their popularity. Now, first I want to talk about strength through joy. And this is English for KDF. KDF, Kraft durch Freude. And strength through joy is part of the larger organization, the DAF. Strength through joy was a large state-operated leisure organization in Nazi Germany, and it was part of the DAF. It was part of the German Labor Front. And we know the German Labor Front was the NSDAP's socialist trade organization, which replaced the various independent trade unions of the Weimar Republic after Adolf Hitler's rise to power. So the KDF was part of the DAF. Now the KDF offered discounts on cinema tickets and sports events. They also promised savers the Volkswagen Beetle, the German, which was a people's car, and it was a symbol of German prosperity. It was a symbol of a prosperous Germany. We also have the Beauty of Labor movement. This was just a movement which improved working conditions in factories, fair enough. It introduced washing facilities and low-cost canteens for workers. We also have the Reich Labor Service, or the RAD. The RAD right here. Established in 1935, really to help mitigate the effects of unemployment. So it was established in 1935. And under this organization, all 18 to 25-year-old men had to do 6 months work service. And this service was unpopular. It was hard manual labor, and it was very poorly paid. So a disadvantage for workers is that there are no more trade unions to fight for their rights. The trade unions were replaced by the DAF. They were replaced by the DAF, as we've seen. They were replaced by the German Labor Front, which was led by Dr. Robert Lee. Dr. Robert Lee led the German Labor Front. Since one of the problems is no more trade unions to fight for workers' rights. And some workers even complained that standards of living were still lower than it had been before Depression. Standard of living still lower than it had been before the Depression. So this is pretty significant. This isn't really what we want. Quickly touching on farming communities, we have the Reich Food Estate for Farmers, led by Richard Deere. And this gave farmers a guaranteed market at fixed prices. We also have the Reich-entailed farm law, which gave peasants or poor agricultural farmers state protection for their farms, so this was important. Now we also have this blood and soil ideology, which was part of the Nazi philosophy, and it's just a little side note. It was a belief that German peasants, these poor agricultural farmers, were actually the basis of Germany's master race. I mean, we all had to start at farming. And so this blood and soil belief that German peasants were the basis of Germany's master race. Let's quickly review autarky in Hitler's Germany. So, reviewing Dr. Schacht and the new plan, we have 1934 to 1936. And Hitler's main aims for the German economy at this time was to recover from the Depression, to recover from the World Depression, and to reduce unemployment. And we know unemployment was a major issue because there were 6 million unemployed in 1933. Some research estimates this even higher at 8.5 million. There are also other major economic problems in 1934. There were farmers struggling to make a living, trade was declining, and the banking system was on the brink of collapse. So continuing with the article, Hitler did not want these economic problems to threaten Nazi rule. If people were unemployed and hungry, social unrest was possible. So the man given the job of solving these problems was Dr. Hjalmar Schacht. And Schacht had been appointed president of the Reichsbank in March 1933, and then he became Minister of Economics in August 1934. So in September 1934, he introduced his new plan, also known as the First Four-Year Plan, and it closely controlled the flow of imports, exports, and foreign currency into and out of Germany. It also increased government spending to reduce unemployment. Hitler also cancelled the reparations ordered under the Treaty of Versailles. So the idea was that Germany should rebuild its economy from its own resources and thus be less dependent on the world economy. Germany did start to recover and Hitler was able to begin to rearm, but this rearmament was low level at first. In 1935, spending on rearmament was 8% of Germany's national product. And most of this was spent not on weapons, but on rebuilding military training schools, barracks, and airfields. Why was spending on rearmament low? Schacht knew that high spending would threaten Germany's economic recovery. Hitler was still cautious about how other powers would view German rearmament. Would they intervene to enforce the disarmament clauses of the Versailles Treaty? The main thrust of the new plan was to invest in public buildings and infrastructure, including railways, telecommunications, and roads such as the autobahns, or motorways. The year 1936 is a turning point in this story. By then, confidence had returned, and unemployment had fallen to 1.6 million. So that's pretty significant. By 1936, unemployment had dropped from 6 million to 1.6 million. So this is 1936, 3 years later. So Hitler had some of the basics in place on which to build his new armed forces. Now he wanted to speed up rearmament and make Germany ready for war within 4 years. By 1936, Hitler believed that a war to defeat communism and world Jewry was not far off. Quickly reviewing Goering and the second four-year plan, Hitler wanted more than to simply speed up rearmament. He accepted the idea of total war. This meant restructuring the German economy so that it could deliver what was needed for war. This was to be done by training workers in skills that could be transferred to war work, building up the type of industry and raw materials needed for war, and by developing substitutes for imported products that might be cut off in the event of the outbreak of war. However, Schacht was not too keen on this change, this total war change, this restructuring of the German economy for war. So in October 1936, Hitler put Hermann Goering in charge of the economy by making him head of the office of the four-year plan. Hitler made his aims clear. The first of these aims was to be achieved by a massive increase in spending on rearmament. So a massive increase in spending on rearmament. The second aim was to be achieved by making Germany self-sufficient in essential war materials such as oil, rubber, and steel. This policy of self-sufficiency was known as autarky, and would free Germany from the threat of the blockade which occurred in World War I. Both aims required the spending of billions of marks. This meant that there would be less government money to pay for imports of food and consumer goods such as clothes, so people would have to tighten their belts. Hitler remembered the First World War, when the German economy had failed to provide the needs of war on the battlefield and on the home front. Hitler did not want to be dependent on supplies from abroad, as these supplies could be cut off in wartime, as it happened to Germany in the First World War. The four-year plan was supposed to achieve self-sufficiency by the following measures. So we do this by achieve self-sufficiency by making as many products as possible in Germany, so less imports. 2, developing substitute products, so synthetic products such as artificial rubber, to replace imported natural rubber and oil made from coal. Also, we have increasing agricultural production, so farming. And we also have the idea of paying for essential imports with blocked marks. This basically means these blocked marks could only be spent in Germany. So the companies selling products to Germany would have to buy something from Germany. This helped Germany afford essential products by saving it from having to buy foreign currency, such as dollars, to pay for them. And we also have recycling waste products. So these were all meant to help achieve self-sufficiency, autarky. So finally, let me read this final area. How did the policies work in practice? So statistics can be difficult to handle, but some are impressive. In 1938 to 39, some 52% of government spending went on the military, compared with 24% in 1913. What this meant on the ground was new industries and factories. For example, iron ore supplies and aluminium production grew rapidly. New products such as synthetic fuel, oil, and rubber were developed. Some of the new products, such as fat made from wood, were tried out on prisoners. Putting rearmament before consumer goods did mean that there was a shortage of fats such as butter and lard for cooking. This led to the guns versus butter debate, as we've seen. In 1938, Hitler ordered the size of the Air Force to be increased by 5 times. In 1939, he approved plans for a large battle fleet. What did all this mean for ordinary Germans? Between 1936 and 1939, the economy had been transformed, but nearly all the new growth had gone into government spending, mostly on rearmament. So was this all a success? Was this all a success? Success. Autarky. As can be seen, ordinary Germans could not escape the impact of Hitler's economic plans. How successful his plans were is another question. He was expecting most of them to be completed by the mid-1940s. Restructuring an economy as large as Germany's was a mammoth task. To judge the success of Hitler's plans, you need to decide how far he achieved his aims for the economy. For example, the 4-year plan set targets each year for different industries. Were these targets reached? Remember, Hitler's aims were first to recover from the Depression, for example, to find work for the millions of unemployed people. Second, to rebuild the German armed forces. Third, to achieve autarky and create an economy that provided what Germany needed in time of war. So I've written those down. First, recover from the Depression, reduce unemployment. They managed to do this. It was 6 million in 1933 to 1.6 million in 1936. Rebuild the German armed forces, and also autarky, achieve economic self-sufficiency. Create an economy that provided what Germany needed in time of war. So Hitler achieved the following things. He had restored full employment, rebuilt the German economic strength. So he restored full employment, rebuilt the German economic strength. He had rebuilt the German armed forces. There was a serious shortage of consumer goods, which wasn't good. There was a serious shortage of raw materials for industry, which wasn't good. Prices were beginning to rise. Inflation, that's not good either. The economy was not ready for anything but a short and sharp war. Let's take a look at children in Nazi Germany. So Hitler wanted to turn the young into loyal Nazis, and he tried to control the 3 greatest influences on the young, namely families, schools, and youth movements, which were popular pre-1933. So for boys, we have these different youth movements being created. For 6 to 10, they were called the Cubs, or the Pimpfen. From 10 to 14, these were called the Deutsches Jungvolk, or the Young German Boys. And 14 to 18 was the Hitler Jugend, or the Hitler Youth. So for girls, we have 10 to 14 called the Jung Mädel, or the Young Girls. 14 to 18 was Deutsche Mädel, or the League of German Girls. And 18 to 21, Glaub, and Shonnet, or Faith and Beauty. So we have all these different age categories for the Hitler Youth, these youth movements. So as we've seen, although the Hitler Youth's origins date back to 1922, from 1933 until 1945, it was a sole official youth organization in Germany. So what were some of its aims? So some of the aims included indoctrinating younger children with Nazi ideology, obedience, idolizing the Führer, Hitler. We also have an emphasis on physical fitness, sacrificing yourself for national good, which is known as Volksgemeinschaft, and improving health and racial purity of the German nation. For boys, the fundamental purpose was to be a strong fighter, and for girls it was to pursue a maternal role and have lots of children. So the Hitler Youth was led by Baldur von Schirach. In 1932, the membership of the Hitler Youth was 100,000, but after it was required to join it in 1933, with the membership in 1934 actually increasing to 35 times to 3.5 million members. All other youth organizations, such as church-based organizations, were actually banned after 1936. So let's take a look at the Nazis in the church. So as we've seen, in June 1933, the Nazis signed a concordat, or an agreement, with the Roman Catholic Church, where the Nazis agreed to stay out of the Catholic Church, provided that the Catholic Church would stay out of politics, provided that the Catholic Church would take an apolitical stance. It would not interfere in politics or have a biased view in politics. It would stay out of politics, take an apolitical stance. So Hitler wanted all the various Protestant churches under the Reich Church, and he hoped that Christians would dominate the Reich Church's slogan, which was the swastika on our breasts and the cross in our hearts. In 1934, the Confessional Church broke away from the Reich Church with the idea of preventing Nazi influence. So we have to realize that the Catholic Church at the time was a global organization. And in the 1930s, nearly all Germans were religious. Most were Christians. So Hitler had to do something about the church. And we've already seen the religious opponents, or some of the opposition to the Nazi Germany, and that's Galen, Niemöller, and Bonhoeffer. Right, let's take a look at education in Nazi Germany. So a good place to start would be the Nazi curriculum. So for PE, there was clearly an emphasis on physical fitness. Around 15% of the curriculum time was devoted to PE. In history, they'd be talking about the rise of the Nazi Party and the injustice of the Treaty of Versailles. You know, Germany was forced to sign it. It was a diktat. It was overly harsh, crippled the German army, all of that. The injustice of the Treaty of Versailles would have been emphasized. So biology would have been primarily focused around racial biology, the justification of the concept of a master race, and the inferiority of the Jews. In German class, there was a focus on national identity. In geography, we'd have the land lost in Versailles, Alsace-Lorraine, the Saarland, Polish corridor, Northern Schleswig, West Prussian Posen, all those things. Land lost at Versailles. And we'd also have Hitler's foreign policy of Lebensraum being devoted to in the Nazi curriculum. Religious studies was dropped in 1937 as it offered dissenting views to Nazi ideology. The religious could preach against or challenge Nazi authority. We have 97% of teachers joining the Nazi Teachers Association. Let's go into a bit more detail with the Hitler Youth. So it became compulsory to join the organization in 1936. I might have said 1933 earlier, that's incorrect. It was compulsory in 1936, and even so, 1 million young people didn't join the Hitler Youth because we have other groups such as the Swing Youth, which were eventually put down. So 1 million young people never joined, notwithstanding the fact that it was compulsory, mandatory. So what were some of the activities of the Hitler Youth? For the boys, we have basic military training, for instance, drill, camp, craft, map reading, the use of guns, physical fitness, camping and trekking, and political indoctrination, so anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews, and the master race ideology that Germans are superior. For the girls, we have preparation for motherhood, domestic skills, so skills at home. This includes sewing, cooking, managing a budget. We also have physical fitness, so camping and trekking, as we've seen, and political indoctrination, so indoctrinating with these ideas of anti-Semitism and the master race. So why did the Nazis focus so much on the youth of Germany? So firstly, they would be the future leaders of Nazi Germany. Hitler wanted a 1,000-year Reich. It only lasted 12 years, but nonetheless. They were also focused on because the children were the easiest group to indoctrinate. They also did this to prepare boys and girls for their future roles, so boys to physical fitness, to join the army, things like that, and girls domestic, to pursue a more domesticated role. Children could also report on their parents or teachers if they descended from Nazi ideology. And also to restore the traditional values of Germany. There had been a lot of decadence, there had been a lot of moral decline during the period of Weimar Germany, during the Golden Age, the Stresemann era. So we want to restore traditional values of Germany, such as the role of woman. And these were the 3 Ks, Kinder, Kuch, and Kirsch. Kinder, Kuch, and Kirsch. And this stands for children. Kinder is children. Kuch is kitchen. And Kirsch is church. So was Nazi policy towards the youth successful or unsuccessful? First reason it was successful is because millions joined the Hitler Youth. These people were attracted by the adventurous activities, and in 1934 it already had 3.5 million members. It was also successful because we have indoctrination via the control of the curriculum and teachers. Some reason it wasn't successful is 1 million children never joined the Hitler Youth despite it being compulsory in 1936. There was also a reduction in the quality of education. Another reason it wasn't successful is because there was disappointment, there was disillusion towards Nazi policy as the years progressed. For instance, during World War II, groups openly opposed the Nazi regime. Now let's take a look at women in Nazi Germany. So in Weimar Germany, women had become increasingly independent, and by 1933 there were 100,000 female teachers, 3,000 female doctors, and 10% of the Reichstag deputies were actually female. So the Nazis saw this as a part of how corrupt and degenerate the Weimar Germany was. So we have some aims being put into place. Hitler put some aims into place. So the Nazis believed men and women had a fundamentally different roles in life. Men were to be the provider and the defender, whilst women had a more domestic role in the home, having children, caring for the family, Kinder, Kuch, Kirsch, children, kitchen, church. So this contrasts with the Weimar situation. So the idea was to reverse the changes of the 1920s. We want to reduce unemployment also by limiting the role of women, so they'll stay at home, so men can come in and claim their jobs. We also want to increase the birth rate so that Germany can become a great power. So Germany needed a larger population because in 1900 there were 2 million births per year, but in 1933 after World War I there were less than 1 million births per year. So this shows the effect of World War I on the population, since there were 2 million deaths, 2 million German deaths in World War I. Another role for women is to increase suitable marriages, so the idea that you can't marry Jews anymore, the Nuremberg laws. Another idea is that you need to organize women into the Volksgemeinschaft, or the German community. So we've got this concept of ideal mothers. What did this look like? First trait was that they didn't work. So 15% of all teachers and all female doctors and civil servants were actually sacked purely because they were female. In terms of appearance, they were generally blonde, heavy-hipped, athletic. They wore full skirts, flats, which meant no heels, and no makeup. In terms of food, they used up leftovers, and one Sunday a month they'd produce a one-pot meal. In terms of attire, they produced their clothes were home produced, so home produced clothes, no imports. There was an emphasis this during Schacht's new plan and Goering's 4-year plan. We want to cut back on imports and make everything in Germany, so home produced clothes. They also didn't smoke, and they were devoted to bringing up their children as loyal Nazis. So they brought up their children as loyal Nazis. So was the Nazi policy towards women successful? Did they achieve their aims? So in terms of developing healthy Germans, infant mortality dropped by 1.1% from 1933 to 1936. So this was a good thing. It was a good thing. Let me redo that tick. This was a good thing. Suitable marriages also increased from 516,000 in 1932 to 740,000 in 1934. We also have birth rates rising, which is good, but then they slowly declined between 1933 and 1939. So there's an argument this could go in the side of not being successful. Now, their aim of reducing female unemployment. Well, actually, their aim of reducing female employment, I should say. They wanted to make sure females didn't have any jobs. This failed because the number of women in employment actually rose, especially during the Second World War. The policy of restricting opportunities for women also failed. The policy was relaxed as more women were needed during the Second World War, since demand for workers and soldiers grew. So this restriction of opportunities failed because the policy was relaxed, since more women were needed as demand for workers and soldiers grew during World War II. Another good point is that we have increased female participation in the Nazi community. So groups in the Nazi community, Volksgemeinschaft. We wanted to incorporate women in the Nazi community and joined different organizations, such as those supporting the war efforts. Some of the policies were actually contradicting. For instance, the need for increased population. The need for increased population clashed. It clashed with the idea of needing women in the workforce during World War II. So either women needed to stay at home and have children to increase the population, or they would need to go into the workforce during World War II. They could only do one or the other. Which one did the Nazis want them to do? There were contradictory policies. So the Nazis abolished marriage loans and introduced a compulsory duty year and a compulsory duty year for women entering the labor force. So I know it's all been quite vague and confusing, the Nazi policies towards women, so I hope to clear this up. So the first main policy was to increase pure German births. And what were the measures it took to do this? Well, they had financial incentives such as marriage loans and birth grants. They said, hey, you get married, you give birth, we're going to give you these financial rewards. We also have improved maternity services, which would try and help increase pure German births. These are all just to try and help increase pure German births. We also have propaganda to raise the self-esteem of mothers and housewives. For instance, awards such as the Mother's Cross women who have a certain number of children. There are also restrictions such as higher taxes on childless couples. Of course, we want people to have children, so we'll tax childless couples, tighter penalties on abortion, and restrictions on contraceptive information. There are also measures introduced for the compulsory sterilization of quote-unquote undesirables, so mentally disabled, things like that. The Lebensborn program was also extended. So this was the encouragement of births outside of marriage. Lebensborn. And as we've seen, in 1933 to 1939, the birth rate did rise, so it did work, but then it slowly declined. So there's an argument that it did work or it didn't work. You can really choose either or for this. And overall assessment, I'm not going to write it out because it would take too long. I'm just going to say it. The increase may have been due more to economic recovery than to Nazi policies or measures. The birth rate rose compared to during the Depression, but did not get back to levels of Weimar Germany. Nazi eugenic policies reduced the population potential. Another Nazi policy towards women, along with increasing pure German births, was to increase suitable marriages. So we want to increase pure German births and increase suitable marriages, and one of the most significant ways it did this was through the October 1935 Blood Protection Law. And this meant that marriage to Jews, black people, and gypsies was forbidden. As we've seen, this was a success. In 1932, there were only 516,000 marriages, but in 1934, there were 740,000, so there was an increase. There was divorces also increased after 1938, but that doesn't matter. The increase in marriages may have been due more to economic optimism than to government policies. For instance, the average size of a family fell. Divorce was extended to help national objectives. The third Nazi policy for women was to develop healthy Germans, and they did this. One of the ways they did this was improving childcare facilities, especially for working mothers. And infant mortality dropped from 7.7% in 1933 to 6.6% in 1936, so this was a success. Suitable marriages was also a success. And this was, the increase in pure German births was a success or a failure depending on how you look at it. One of the fourth policies was to restrict female educational opportunities. They wanted to prepare women for their proper role at home, not out pursuing academic or educational purposes. They did this by limiting the university enrollment of women to 10%. Eventually, these restrictions were dropped because there was a great demand for well-educated workers. And there was a drop in numbers of women at university until the Second World War, where the numbers of women actually rose because there was a demand for well-educated workers. So restrictions on opportunities for women were increasingly relaxed as women were needed since demand for workers and soldiers grew. The fifth Nazi policy was to reduce female employment. So in 1936, one of the major ways they did this was by banning women from being judges or lawyers. They also did many other things which would take a very long time to write down. But it turns out the number of women in employment actually rose. So this was a failure. The number of women in employment actually rose. And there was a further increase during the war as the demand for women were needed. And so Nazi policies had a marginal effect on the overall employment of women. The main impact was on the professions. During the war, women were less mobilized than in the United States or the United Kingdom. And we also have another aim of organizing women and incorporating them in the Nazi community. So no female Nazi members of the Reichstag were permitted. 2 women organizations were created, the NSF and DFW. These aren't very significant. Nazi women's organizations support the war effort, but there was actually an increased participation in Nazi bodies. So So this worked. There was an increase in women in the Nazi community. In many ways, the Nazis gave increased opportunities for women to become involved in the public life, although they were excluded from decision making. But that's not too significant, so I won't write it down. Mainly, we have the main aims were increasing pure German births, which was a success depending on how you look at it, increasing suitable marriages, which was also a success, developing healthy Germans was a success, the infant mortality rate dropped, restricting female education, no opportunities, that failed, they needed more women, and reducing female employment also failed. The number of women in employment actually rose. So hopefully this clears up the Nazi policies towards women. You can go into immense detail, but I don't want to go too deep into detail here. I want to look at minorities in Nazi Germany. So why did the master race, these pure Germans, fear inferiors such as Jews, gypsies, and black people? First was because of a belief in a form of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. So Aryans believed they were superior to all other races because of social Darwinism. So superior to Jews or Slavs, for instance. We also have Germany had lost World War I because it had been divided and weakened. That was the idea anyway. The master race had been contaminated by mixing with the other races. We also look at the vast number of Germans killed in World War I. 2 million Germans. So the idea was that now there were too many inferiors and not enough pure Germans left. We also have the idea that Germany was burdened with quote-unquote undesirables, those who cannot contribute to the German society, and those who were an unwanted burden on German resources. For instance, with the mentally and physically disabled, Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, homosexuals, prostitutes, alcoholics, and the work-shy. So the aims, because of all these minorities and the problems they posed, the aims were to create a national community, a Volksgemeinschaft. People needed to be pure Aryans, physically and mentally fit, socially useful, and supporters of Nazism. So some of the policies were selective breeding, the Lebensborn program, the idea of birth before marriage, and Nuremberg laws, so you can't marry Jews. We also have another policy is the elimination of undesirables, anyone considered a burden on society, sometimes through euthanasia, but Galen eventually stopped this. But, for example, some of these undesirables include, for instance, the unhealthy, the obese, mentally disabled, physically disabled, tramps, beggars, alcoholics, prostitutes, homosexuals, juvenile delinquents, and gypsies were targeted. We also have propaganda, encouraging resentment or bitter indignation at having been treated unfairly by these minorities. We also have the sterilization law in 1933, which is particularly significant. This allowed the Nazis to sterilize people, so they can't have children, with certain illnesses, for instance, simple-mindedness, and chronic alcoholism. Mindedness. Why did I write mindednesses? Mindedness and chronic alcoholism. Chronic alcoholism. This was not unique to Germany. Between 1934 and 1945, over 300,000 men and women were compulsorily sterilized. 300,000 men and women between 1934 and 1945. We also have concentration camps. Many of the work-shy ended up here. In concentration camps. So in 1939, we had the euthanasia campaign. The Nazis actually killed 12,000 mentally ill. Fortunately, it was stopped by Galen in 1941. Let's look at a brief timeline of anti-Semitic policies or anti-Jewish policies. In 1933, we have an official one-day boycott of Jewish shops, lawyers, and doctors all over Germany. In 1934, we have the general increase in anti-Jewish propaganda which begins to disseminate across Germany and become ubiquitous. In May 1935, Jews were forbidden to join the army. In 1935, September 1935, with the Nuremberg Laws, the first law was the protection of German blood and honor. This banned marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. And we also had the Reich Citizenship Law, the second law, which meant that Jews were made subjects rather than citizens, so they lost certain rights. They were no longer citizens. In 1936, anti-Semitism was limited due to the Berlin Olympics. We'll go into more detail on that soon. In September 1937, for the first time in 2 years, Hitler made an outspoken attack on the Jews. More Jewish businesses were confiscated. In April 1938, Jews had to register their property, making it easier to confiscate. And in June to July 1938, Jewish doctors, dentists, and lawyers were forbidden to treat Aryans. So it's just getting worse and worse. In October 1938, Jews had to have a red letter J on their passports. In November 1938, we have Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, and also Jewish children were now not allowed to attend other schools. Jewish children were only allowed to attend, as you might guess, Jewish schools. In December 1938, remaining Jewish businesses were confiscated. In January 1939, all Jews had to add new first names, Sarah for women and Israel for men, and the Reich Office for Jewish Immigration was established, so Jewish immigration, so Jews could all just leave Germany and essentially go somewhere else. So one important note is that there was anti-Jewish propaganda that all of the Jews' wealth was derived, because Jews were generally rich and wealthy, it was all derived from the exploitation of Germany. And there was also propaganda that older Jews would prey on young German girls, although it was mostly false. And they got blamed for the loss of World War I, which was certainly unfair, so the Jews were just persecuted immensely.
Alright, so now let's talk about the Holocaust. The actual Holocaust. So as we know, Poland was invaded by Germany on September the 1st, 1939. The USSR was invaded on June 22nd, 1941. And in Poland, around 3 million Jews were killed. 3 million Jewish people were killed. And in the USSR, even more, 4.5 million Jews. So the Einsatzgruppen was the SS squad that followed the German army, eliminating Jews, eliminating enemies of the Nazis, such as Jews and communists. So it's thought to have killed 1 million Jews by shooting them. And as we know, the Holocaust was a mass slaughter of millions of Jews, around 6 million in total, by the Nazis. But of course, persecution also occurred from the USSR's part, but on the part of the Nazis, around 6 million were killed. Now, the ghettos were sealed sections of a particular city where the Jews were forced to live, and they were particularly common in Poland. Because we have the Warsaw Ghetto. Warsaw is the capital of Poland. The Warsaw Ghetto was particularly infamous. In January 1942, we had the Wannsee Conference. So Wannsee is a suburb in Berlin, and a decision by the Nazis to implement the final solution to the Jewish problem by killing the entire Jewish population. And this introduces the idea of death camps. For instance, in Auschwitz, 1 million Jews were killed. In the gas chambers, in total, around 6 million Jews were killed. And there are also other victims, such as gypsies. 500,000 of them were killed. Now, we also have Kristallnacht. Kristall, 2 L's, Nacht. And that was in 1938. November 1938, should I be more precise. November 1938. So it started when a young Jew killed a German diplomat in Paris. And the Nazis used this as an excuse to launch a violent revenge on the Jews. So this was essentially Kristallnacht. So the SS troopers came in and smashed up Jewish shops, workplaces, and synagogues, Jewish prayer buildings.
So 91 Jews were actually murdered, 20,000 were sent to concentration camps, and thousands actually left the country, thousands left Germany. So the Nazis claimed this was a purely spontaneous reaction, although it was completely pre-planned. The SS didn't wear uniforms, so it looked more like it was spontaneous. And the purpose was to build up a campaign against the Jews. But really, you can't really launch an attack on an entire Jewish population because of one incident. It's quite tenuous. So the idea was to encourage Jewish immigration from Germany, and the Jews were forced to pay 1 billion Reichsmark for damages caused. Right, now let's look at propaganda in Nazi Germany. So some of the aims were to convince the Germans of the benefits of Nazism, solidarity of the national community, so Volksgemeinschaft, the joining together, the importance of the national community, and racial purity of the Nazis, the social Darwinism ideology. We also have hatred of enemies outside and within Germany, such as the Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, blacks. We've seen all this. We have trust in Hitler's leadership, another propaganda aim, and psychological preparation and mobilization for another war. We also have upholding and strengthening the morale during the war. So upholding and strengthening morale during the war. We also want to prevent alternative messages from being heard. For some examples of propaganda, we have books against the German message being burned, artists had to be Nazi approved, and there were tight control of newspapers, so they weren't allowed to print anti-Nazi ideas. All cinema films had to have a pro-Nazi message. Remember, there were 1 million people who were watching films in 1942. There was 1 million audience. So it was pretty big films, so they had to have a pro-Nazi message. Jazz music was also banned because blacks were considered inferior. This is ridiculous, but it's another example of propaganda. There was also radio broadcasting to spread the Nazi messages. And the radios only picked up German broadcasts. 16 million cheap radios were available in 1942, also known as the People's Receivers. Another instance of propaganda is the use of festivals with the Nuremberg rallies, which were new celebration days created to promote Nazi messages, to promote the Nazi message. So expounding on these ideas of propaganda, we have the Berlin Olympics in 1936. So anti-Semitism was toned down during the 1936 Berlin Olympics, and the idea was that it was to avoid other countries from gaining a negative image of Nazi Germany. And the idea is that it would also make Germany look peaceful and not totalitarian. They tried to also tone down anti-Semitism by selecting one Jew in the team in the Olympics, the German team, and this was Helen Mayer. And this person got a silver in fencing. So this challenged the Nazi superiority idea, the social Darwinism, the Aryan superiority idea. The Nazis also controlled access of the athletes to the rest of Germany, so it limited what they were able to see. They didn't want them to see how dangerous and tyrannical Germany really was. It didn't want them to see the concentration camps and all of that. So this was an opportunity for the Nazis to display the new Germany, which contrasts with the old Weimar Germany, and to display Aryan racial superiority, since the Nazis had topped the medal table with first place in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Now, Jesse Owens challenged this idea particularly well. He challenged this idea of Aryan German racial superiority, since he was an African American, and he actually won 4 gold medals. So we've got an article on the Berlin Olympics, which I'll proceed to read some of. So in January 1933, 2 years after the International Olympic Committee chose Berlin as the site for the 1936 Olympic Games, Hitler came to power as Chancellor of Germany. In the early 1930s, he won support by promising a new Germany at a time of hunger, business failure, and great political and social unrest. In his speeches, he spoke about the importance of racial purity and the superiority of the German Aryan. These racist beliefs were spread through books, newspapers, radio, and posters, and yet conveniently hidden during the Olympic Games of 1936. Despite the appearance of a confident Germany, The lives of Jewish men, women, and children were soon to change dramatically in Nazi Germany, and eventually Europe. The Berlin Olympic Games were used as a propaganda exercise for the benefit of the new Nazi regime and provided only a brief interlude in the persecution of the Jewish people. Then goes to talk about the Nazification of sport, so how Hitler used sport in the drive to purify and strengthen the Aryan race and to prepare the German youth for war. Then it goes to talk about the Nazi takeover of the Olympics. And a whole bunch of other issues. And the African American success, so Jesse Owens, who took home 4 gold medals. Hitler refused to shake the hand of Jesse Owens. But the conclusion was that Germany did emerge from the Olympics victorious. Its athletes captured the most medals, and German organization and hospitality won the praise of visitors. Some found reason to hope that the peaceful interlude would last. In fact, the propaganda efforts continued well after the Olympics, with the world release in 1938 of Olympia, a controversial film documentary of the Games produced. However, the pause in Germany's anti-Jewish campaign was brief. In 1938, troops marched into Austria, and the Nazis stepped up their anti-Jewish activities. On the evening of the 9th of November 1938, called Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, rioters burned more than 1,000 synagogues in Germany and Austria. They looted 7,000 Jewish businesses and killed dozens of Jews in an assault organized by Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. When most think about the 1936 Olympics, they remember the accomplishments of Jesse Owens. His performance at Berlin was remarkable and would inspire later African-American Olympians such as Carl Lewis. Only a few writers at the time, such as William Shirer, regarded the Berlin glitter as merely hiding a racist, militaristic regime. And on August 16th, he wrote, "I'm afraid the Nazis have succeeded with their propaganda. First, they have run the games on a lavish, never-before-experienced scale, and this has appealed to the athletes. Second, they have put up a very good front for the general visitors, especially the big businessmen. The Olympics would prove to be a temporary lapse in the persecution of the Jews and an example of the Nazi propaganda machine in action, as Germany's Jewish population was to discover in the terrible murders and arson attacks of Kristallnacht in 1938. So I'm not going to read the whole article, but I'm sure that's enough in some of the key points from it. So let's take a look at some of the effects of World War II. So as we know, in 1939 to 1941, the war goes well for Germany. Rationing is introduced, so the diet improves for 40% of the Germans. And resources were also available from the conquered territories, such as Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and the Soviet Union. However, in 1941 to 1943, as we know, the tide turns against Germany. There were huge casualties from the war in the USSR, who did the bulk of the fighting, 11 million military Soviet deaths. And Germany, there were around 4.4 million military deaths, although the total deaths, including civilian deaths, were much higher. We have total war in 1943 to 1944, where anything not connected to the war effort was eliminated, such as professional sport or the production of civilian clothing. Propaganda films were continued, e.g. the movie Kohlberg, where around 200,000 soldiers were employed as extras for the movie. Now we have women were drafted into the labor force. We also have the use of slave and foreign labor. For instance, there were 7 million foreign laborers in Germany by 1944. Air raids were also intensified. For instance, with the Hamburg firestorm in 1943. We also have a lot of bombs being dropped on Britain and Germany between 1940 and 1945, as I'm sure you're aware. Just as an idea, in 1940, around 10,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Germany. On Britain, around 36,000 tons were dropped on Britain. However, In 1945, when Germany was clearly losing, 500,000 tons were actually devastated on Germany, whilst only around 800 tons were dropped on Britain, I should say. So it's clear that Germany was definitely losing as we progressed through the 1940s till 1945. With failure and defeat in 1944 to 1945, Goebbels became the Reich trustee for total war. All areas of entertainment except for cinemas were closed, and the age limit of compulsory labor for women was raised to 50. The Volkssturm was also formed, a national military militia. A national militia developed in the final months. Air raids were also continued. In February 1945, the city of Dresden was 70% destroyed, and in total 800,000 German civilians were killed from air raids. So the British were just going completely, went complete, they were completely vengeful and hostile at this point. They had one goal: to defeat Germany, even if that meant by killing civilians. And whether that was a moral thing to do, we probably not. Hitler committed suicide on the 30th of April 1945, and we have victory in Europe Day on the 8th of May 1945, as we know. Here's a question. How successful was the Nazi regime in dealing with opposition? So we'll have some arguments for why it was successful and some arguments for why it was unsuccessful. So for successful, we have the Hitler Youth, 3.5 million members in 1934, up from 100,000 in 1932, and it's the biggest youth organization in the world. So the Gestapo sent communists and opposition to concentration camps. We also have non-violent agreements such as the Concordat, which eliminated the threat from the church, and also the formation of a one-party state, which eliminated other political opposition. You could also argue it was successful because it appeased opposition, such as Galen on the issue of euthanasia. You could argue it was unsuccessful because of the existing opposition, such as the Edelweiss Pirates, the White Rose Group, the Swing Movement, and also the July Bomb Plot, and the church opponents Galen, Niemöller, and Bonhoeffer. But we've already discussed all of this opposition. Here's another question. How far did life for workers improve in Nazi Germany? So we'll look at some arguments for why it improved and for why it didn't improve. Firstly, unemployment was reduced. As we know, there were 6 million unemployed in 1933, and that dropped to around 1 million in 1938, but some figures will vary. We also have strengths through Joy. The KDF offers discounts on cinema and promises a Volkswagen Beetle for German families who save for it. We also have the beauty of labor movement, so improved conditions for workers, and the Reich food estate for farmers, guaranteeing a secured market. So we've got a whole collection of things here. Some arguments that didn't improve. One obvious one is that Goering neglected consumer goods in his 4-year plan. He focused too much on making guns and not enough on butter and other consumer goods. So consumer goods were neglected. That's bad for workers. We also have the DAF replacing trade unions. And trade unions fought for workers' rights. And the DAF certainly wasn't as accommodating as trade unions would have been for workers. And it was led by Robert Lee, as we've seen. And Jews lost jobs, and businesses and females were sacked. So there's a collection of arguments for that life for workers didn't improve. So the Nazis controlled the German people through the police state. So what are some reasons we agree with that, and some reasons we disagree with that? So some reasons they did control them through the police state is because the Gestapo sent opposition to concentration camps. And we also have the court system allowing prosecution without trial and unlimited power to search houses. The Gestapo was given unlimited power to search houses, phone tapping, and people were concerned about speaking out. Some reasons the Nazis didn't control the people through the police state is because of propaganda. They used propaganda to control people, indoctrinating young people. And we also have censorship. And we have policies that gained support, popular policies which gained support, such as reversal of the Treaty of Versailles. That's how the Nazis controlled the German people, through their popular policies. They had gained support. There were also an immense number of young people in the Hitler Youth, 3.5 million in 1934. So this is another way they controlled the German people. And we also the school curriculum changes, which helped them control the German people, indoctrinating. Again, it comes under propaganda, indoctrinating younger people, teaching them what to think, not how to think.